All of
So
them.
YouTube comments, YouTube, Facebook, whatever comments are automatically. All right. Looks like we're live.
Okay, great. Well, friends, welcome to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. Um, Today is the 22nd of January. If you read the bourgeois press, it looks like the world has completely changed and we're in a different place entirely. But you're also in the same place as you were last week. You're with us on Give the People What They Want with Prashant from People's Dispatch, Zoe from People's Dispatch, and me, Vijay from Globetrotter. Zoe, you had something you want to start us off with?
Yes. Well, I wanted to point out that this week we have a new logo thanks to the lead designer at Tricontinental, Tings Chuck. It's amazing. Check it out. And we're also our technical support, which I wanted to point out, our producer, Surangia, who's doing all of the behind the scenes work to make this a podcast, to make it a live stream, and to keep giving the people what they want. So shout out to those amazing comrades.
Well, it's necessary for us to say that on the 20th of January, Joe Biden was inaugurated as the president of the United States of America. Whatever one might think, it's still the most powerful country with the largest military and so on, and therefore the whole world was watching to see what was going to happen in Washington D.C. January 6th, we saw a bunch of ruffians come in and take charge of parts of the city. Well, here, the bourgeois media was telling us that Biden has restored the republic already. Zoe, is the US republic restored? And is the United States of America once more the greatest country in the world?
Well, actually, Vijay, news just in: imperialism has actually ended. The U.S. is no longer going to invade, sanction, or attack any other countries. We are in a new decade. We're in a new age. It's really exciting. The U.S. is once again on top, and it just has its own clout to maintain its power. So it's a great day. It's been a great week, I think, all around. But on a more serious note, I think no, none of this is true. And of course, we've seen the liberal bourgeois media, the corporate media, as our friend Sainath likes to say, being really applauding this transition. It's interesting what you say, Vijay. The words that they've said is like the restoration of the republic. America's back. And I think what we know, and what all of our friends around the world who are struggling and on the ground know, is that America being back is not something to applaud. It never went away, but perhaps the more refined version of of bombing countries, of intervening in other countries, is maybe back. Biden, of course, will not maybe take to Twitter to be harassing other countries in the same way that Trump was. But we've already seen in his first week that there's been a pretty strong commitment to carrying forward some of the reprehensible policies that Donald Trump took out. For example, there is some hope. I mean, reserved hope, but there was some hope that there would be maybe some shift, for example, in the policy towards Venezuela, for example. Carlos Vecchio, Juan Guaido's in-charge representative in the United States, was invited to the inauguration, which I think is a very strong, sending a very strong message. And of course, Blinken, the Secretary of State, has already told media that they will continue to recognize Juan Guaido, which of course, as we know, as of January 5th, Juan Guaido is not even an elected representative. So what does this even mean? And I think, of course, in domestic policies, we might see an improvement. We are seeing an improvement in certain ways. Biden's, economic recovery plan does include responding to the demand that unions and people in workplaces have been demanding for the past, several years, which is a $15 minimum wage. So this is a huge victory, of course, for organized labor, for organized people's movements. We can't see it as just Biden, doing a charitable deed. This is, of course, a people's movement's victory. And so we'll see some shifts, I think, in domestic policy and supporting the population, especially given that over 400,000 people have died from coronavirus. They have to kind of take some policies to ensure that people are going to get vaccinated, to ensure that people can stay home, because it's more than anything, I think, for Biden and for the US, it's a global embarrassment that the richest country in the world has such an abominable policy. But I think we're going to see that many of the foreign policy orientations are going to remain the same. Approach on China still going to remain as an aggression. I think I recommend people to check out the Tricontinental Dossier Twilight on the position of the U.S. with regards to the rest of the world and its declining authority, but, of course, all these other issues. So I think that's a little bit of the landscape that we can be looking at in terms of Biden, the U.S., and what does this mean for the rest of the world.
I think what you say is quite true about the domestic policy, because on the first day he goes straight to the Oval Office, signs executive orders that were humane. I mean, the thing is that Trump was so abominable. Trump pushed such horrible policies that if Biden just returns to the level of US normalcy, it's an improvement. You're quite right. One shouldn't forget that, though. There will be people domestically in the US that will benefit. But I mean, I just want to say that if there is domestic unrest in the US, it makes it harder to operate overseas. So quelling domestic unrest sometimes will enable more efficient use of US power overseas. So be careful, people. Don't have too many illusions, I suppose. Having too many illusions. Last year, I was quite surprised to read that in Tunisia last year, there were 6,500 protests recorded last year. 6,500 protests in a country like Tunisia, which was, the success story of the Arab Spring from 10 years ago. It was the 10th year anniversary of the Arab Spring. We've already commemorated that. Hard for people to absorb this, that what's happening in Tunisia is actually what's happening around the world. Anti-austerity type protests. Prashant, you've been covering this in People's Dispatch. What's the story behind the uprising in Tunisia?
Absolutely. It's interesting because we were talking about, of course, the United States and its deviation from the so-called normal and its return to that. And in Tunisia, what we're seeing is, in some senses, another aspect of that playing out, because the protests that we're talking about started on the anniversary of the resignation of Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, the long-term dictator of Tunisia, who was overthrown in the Arab Spring. And after all these years, the Tunisian people are on the streets because they feel that the most basic slogans that they had fought for during the Arab Spring, which is employment, freedom, and dignity, that was one of the mobilizing slogans at that time, that is nowhere close to being achieved. And the numbers themselves show it, because if you look at, say, the 15 to 25 age group, over 36% of the young people there are unemployed. And this is really a sign that leaders across the world, people need to take a look at, movements take a look. When you have such a young population, 36% of these young people without jobs, and even those with jobs often in temporary employment, in seasonal employment. At a time like this, corruption is high. There is complete political chaos. For most of last year, Tunisia was in utter political chaos. And all the promises of the Arab Spring for these young Tunisians seem to have been betrayed. So our reporters have been talking to activists of the Workers' Party of Tunisia, for instance, who have very clearly highlighted the fact that this is basically an issue of all these promises being completely not met, of complete betrayal. And it's an interesting thing, because I think across the world, what we're seeing is that the COVID-19 pandemic, we've talked about this before, the COVID-19 pandemic is actually brought to the fore the structural weaknesses of this neoliberal model of development that you're referring to. That everything that was wrong and brutal about this has come out with even more force. In a country like Tunisia is a perfect example, because tourism used to provide a huge amount of, say, revenue, livelihoods, that collapsed. And often all it takes is, say, a few months or many months of, say, a lot of aspects of society and life being closed, and then you realize how fragile the model that or the lack of a model basically is for the people. And so we saw hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets actually from January 14th onwards. the security forces responding with a great amount of brutality. The reports say that over 1,000 people have been detained or arrested, many of them minors, which is again very indicative of the kind of protests that we are seeing. There was an incident of police violence on a shepherd, very similar to the incident 10 years ago, of course. And all this is basically, I think, brought out to the people of, to the entire world. And like you said, it's a very interesting protest also to see, because Tunisia was considered one of the few success stories of the Arab Spring. We saw what happened in Egypt. We saw what happened in many other countries where it started, but Tunisia had transitioned into democracy. But this transition has been really, it has not really gone as deep. It has not brought the answer, the aspirations of the people. The president and prime minister responded in the most uh, conventional or mundane way, saying we understand your concerns, but those really don't, those really don't cut it as far as these youth are concerned. So these protests are, I think, very significant to keep a look at. Like you said, over last year, especially in, for instance, the Tatooine region, there's been a huge amount of protests over unemployment. These issues have been building up. So we're definitely likely to see more happening in this country. We know what happened in Algeria, neighboring Algeria, of course. The youth mobilized strongly to overthrow another long-time ruler. So youth power very central to this movement right now.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget that staying on the continent of Africa, we last week talked about the election in Kenya, where Bobby Wine,
Uganda.
Pardon?
In
Sorry,
Uganda.
in Uganda. Sorry, Bobby Wine, was is under house arrest. The median age in Uganda is about 16 years old. That means half the population is under 16. Museveni, has been in power for, I don't know, what is it, 20 some years?
36 years. Yes.
36 years, good God.
Yeah.
36 years Museveni has been in power. Museveni has been in power longer than twice the median age of Uganda. That's incredible. So the question of youth having their voice heard, whether it's in Uganda or Tunisia, this is a very salient issue. There's protests, and we'll come back, I know, to the protests in Pakistan, because I think there's the belt of protests that we're going to look at. But I wanted to just quickly come to the other side and say, if we cross the Atlantic, we have been covering, you've covered it at People's Dispatch, the disgraceful episode in Brazil, in the state of Manaus. Disgraceful. As a reporter, it's hard not to editorialize. I don't know how any reporter can report on what's happening in Brazil with a so-called objective, voice. It's not possible. The fact that a government can be given advance warning of oxygen, running out by a private contractor, it shows you how in these countries privatization has really destroyed health systems and so on. And the government reacted to that plea with such callousness. In fact, as you wrote at People's Dispatch, the Venezuelan government sent oxygen to Manaus, a city in Brazil, faster than the government in Brasilia did anything. So on the People's Dispatch website, there's a statement that Noam Chomsky and I wrote about this, and I'd ask people to go and take a look at it, because the point is, what Chomsky and I talk about there is that this is not something about Manaus. This is not even something about Brazil. It's about the criminal incompetence of these governments in the United States, United Kingdom, India, Brazil, and so on. And there may be time to impanel a citizens' tribunal to start collecting information, because, as you know, amnesia is the greatest enemy of the people, and we cannot allow the evidence of any of this to be lost. So I just hope that when we think about the protests in Uganda, when we think about the protests in Tunisia, when we think about the deep despair in Brazil, people are despairing. The mood is despair, not even people coming on the streets and so on. So I just think we need to have this on our radar. We can't forget the criminal incompetence of the governments. I mean, I want to come back to protests, Prashant, because in Pakistan, look, we've seen protests happen periodically. This is something very interesting, and I was very happy to read the story at People's Dispatch, because it's not getting covered outside Pakistan much. A doctor is killed. As far as I know, nobody knows who killed the doctor, and people are outraged. Why are people outraged because a doctor is killed? I mean, doctors might get killed all the time, but this is a pandemic. A doctor is killed during the pandemic. Why are people upset?
Exactly. So we're talking about Dr. Waliullah Davar, of course, who was killed on the 16th of January. Like you said, there's no clarity on what exactly happened. It's like often happens in the region, it's attributed to unknown gunmen, which is a very convenient term, of course, because it's out in the air. There have been protests by doctors. There have been protests by the Pashtun Tahfuz movement. This happened in North Waziristan. The larger issue here, of course, is this culture of impunity that has been going on for many, many years right now. And the Pashtun Tahfuz movement or the Pashtun protection movement actually emerged in response to this, because the kind of environment that has been created by the Pakistani state, which has actually over time, at various points of time, supported the Taliban, supported other extremist outfits. All of this, of course, also aided by the United States and its allies as well. And the kind of impact it has had on the people's lives. There was a huge issue with landmines. In fact, that was one of the original demands of the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, that they wanted the removal of landmines because they were causing that amount of damage to the people. There's been innumerable disappearances, tens of thousands of disappearances, so many extrajudicial killings that have taken place. And in this region, that's the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, the Pashtun community especially has been mobilizing time and again, despite immense repression by the state. And it's important to note that one of the most prominent leaders of this movement, Ali Wazir, is still in prison. So he was arrested in December on very vague charges of, talking against the state. He's been, his family, this is a horrible family history of continuous attacks by militants, continuous repression by the state. He was arrested last year also. Other leaders of the movement again arrested, imprisoned on various very frivolous charges. Of course, Ali Wazir is a member of the National Assembly of Pakistan, and he is still in prison on these charges. It's been over a month right now. And I believe even now protests are going on in many parts of the world among the community, demanding his release. And in this context, exactly, the assassination of a doctor, I think, paints an even more poignant picture, because I believe he was returning back from seeing patients. And here is somebody who's in the course of his duty being killed by something is, at one level, something is vague as an unidentified gunman, but is at a very concrete level, a result of state policies, a result of the kind of oppression and systematic collusion that the state has been doing along with these militias, along with these, say, armed elements for their own geostrategic issues. So I think this is one of those issues which we some often forget, because people just tend to keep Afghanistan, Pakistan, those regions aside as, it's too complicated to talk about. But like we often come back on this show, the human cost is really, really disturbing and depressing.
It's interesting. We've covered these regions. I mean, I've covered that whole belt from the northern Pakistan out to the Mediterranean. And there's a way in which people talk about these assassinations. People will say, the power did it. Vague things like this. Everybody has an idea who did it, but you can't really pin it down. I mean, I remember my dear friend Salim Shahzad, who was murdered by the Pakistani government in the naval building in Karachi. Salim used to always say things like that. The power did it. The power did it. The power did it. And I would say, what do you mean? And he said, we all know who did it. This is a shorthand. And the anger comes, I think, from that, is that there's no way to even pin it down, and it's frustrating. So Salim was murdered outside, his body was thrown outside Karachi. He was on the trail of bin Laden. He was killed in 2011. A young reporter, we were colleagues at Asia Times. And, we still don't know exactly who killed him. There's no clarity. So, here it is, the power once more. Zoe, I believe, by the way, that you are once again going to cover an election. And this is an election that's going to take place very soon in Ecuador. What is happening in that Ecuadorian election?
Yes. Well, hopefully all goes well and I'll be able to cover the elections. But it's a really important election that's going to be, a determining factor for both the future of Ecuador, but also in the region, because of course this election is part of a series that's happening across Latin America, which we kind of see the beginning of with Bolivia, Venezuela. We have Ecuador now in February, Chile and Peru, which are happening in April. And essentially, these are presidential elections as well, just general elections with the assembly also being voted on. And the past 4 years in Ecuador have been, characterized by most as betrayal, as, complete turn, a 180 turn on what had been happening in the past, decade. Lenin Moreno, of course, was took office in 2017. He was supposed to be the predecessor and continuing the legacy of Rafael Correa and the Citizens' Revolution, which, of course, is not exempt from criticisms, but was very integral in putting people's needs first, in developing a national economy in Ecuador, in favoring regional integration, in participating in instances such as ALBA, in UNASUR, in all these regional integration mechanisms which seek to counter US hegemony within Latin America. And I think this is really key because one of the first things that Lenin Moreno does when he takes office is not the IMF deal, which I'll get to in a second, but it is, taking a very close position with the United States. And so, for example, with regards to Venezuela, so Ecuador has been a historic ally of Venezuela, especially during the first decade of the 2000s. But what we see with Lenin Moreno is that he, Ecuador kind of pushes away from all of the support to Venezuela, joins, is among the ranks of the Lima group, recognizes Guaido and takes a lot of other positions against Venezuela, speaks out against Venezuela constantly. And then, of course, the economic policies that Lenin Moreno adopted during his 4 years have wreaked havoc. I mean, I can't understate the impact that the neoliberal policies have had in Ecuador. I mean, I think some of us saw the really distressing images in the first couple of months of the pandemic in Ecuador when in Guayaquil, people's bodies were just strewn on the streets because there was nowhere to put them, because the public health infrastructure collapsed and there was no way for people to be treated. The ICUs were overrun. I mean, the precarious work and the sector has greatly increased. Protections for people's labor rights have just completely been pulled back. There's also been, geostrategic agreements with the United States. So, for example, there have been talks of the Galapagos Islands, which many of us know for its incredible importance for biodiversity, for scientific research, as being used for the United States in one of their, I'm not remembering exactly now, but one of their strategic kind of bases. So this has been the government of Lenin Moreno, getting closer to the United States, implementing aggressive, backward neoliberal policies. And now these elections have been extremely conflicted. I mean, there's been numerous attempts by the establishment, by institutions, to prevent the ticket of the Citizens' Revolution, which is represented by a new coalition of left parties. But Rafael Correa was originally supposed to serve on the ticket as vice president. He, of course, through a number of legal mechanisms, I think Ecuador is one of the countries where lawfare has been, rolled out on a level that's, unseen. And so Rafael Correa was disqualified from participating. They used all these very bizarre legal, mechanisms, etc. And even the ticket of Andrés Arauz and his running mate, Rascabal, even they had a lot of difficulties being registered. And so I mean, the Ecuadorian elites know that this is the ticket that is, winning approval of the majorities because of what they've put the people through for these past 4 years. They already have a very high approval rating. But, there's even been corruption scandals with regards to elections leading up to the elections are happening on February 7th. But just last week there was a, $1 million corruption scandal involving false printing of the election ballots because it's not an electronic voting system there. And so they, messed up one of the logos and there goes, some millions of dollars. So I think we definitely have to be looking out to these elections, supporting, the Ecuadorian people and their right to choose and elect who they want to elect. And hopefully this will mean a rolling back of neoliberalism, a rolling back of pro-US stances, and hope for the Ecuadorian people.
Well, I just reported a story which makes that a little more doubtful, because this is a story about how Mr. Moreno, in the last weeks before the election, has cut a very interesting deal with the United States government. You see, Rafael Correa had borrowed roughly $5 billion from Chinese banks for infrastructure projects, including some dams and so on. And the Chinese banks made it very clear that there was no need to do any debt payment. They said you can wait till March 2020, which means the timetable will run till 2029. And Lenin Moreno went on Twitter and celebrated this. But the next minute, he cut a deal with the US government. So the US government is going to provide Ecuador with the money to pay off the Chinese debt. And the quid pro quo is then Ecuador will not use Chinese telecommunications companies. It's a really scandalous thing, which will trap whatever administration comes in when it's inaugurated. They will be trapped into this deal. So, this is the way they play. It's fascinating. And of course, this is one of those stories, zero reporting. If I talked to lots of people in Ecuador, tried to build a story, and I just couldn't find stuff, that was publicly available. It's one of those great instances where the US-China tussle, particularly this US-imposed tussle, is finding a battlefield, as it were, in Latin America. And, people in Ecuador might want to have a cheap and good quality mobile network. You may not be able to get it. They may have to go with a US provider, which is, second-rate technology compared to Huawei and ZTE. So anyway, it's part of the story. And I'm sure when you're in reporting the election, this may be somewhere in the very far back, although I doubt anybody will mention it. These sort of big things don't get mentioned. Meanwhile, it's important to say that we're talking about China and the US and South America. The Chinese government, as Trump got on his helicopter and then got on Air Force One to fly to Florida, the Chinese government decided to do some mischievous things, amusing things in a way. People's Dispatch reported, well, one of them is a sober thing, asking the US to come back to the Iran deal. Let's leave that. Everybody's asking about that. It's the other thing that I found quite interesting. Guys, what has People's Dispatch reported about what China is saying about this other thing?
Right. It's kind of crazy. Zoe, you want to take a lead on that one?
Yeah, I think they basically sanctioned former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and 27 other members of the administration of former president, weird to say that, right? Former President Donald Trump, for very just things, for violating China's sovereignty and being responsible for U.S. moves on China-related issues. And I think, this is fair, to be honest. They've been harassing China for the past couple of years, calling, the worst pandemic in history the China virus. Just saying unconscionable things and having no backlash, nothing, not facing any response from this. So honestly, as they say in that musical, they had it coming.
Well, but it is interesting that the United States has got unilateral sanctions against I don't know how many individuals, including probably the entirety of the Venezuelan government, the sitting
Yes.
government of Venezuela. And I thought it was quite interesting to see another country sanction U.S. officials. When the International Criminal Court tried to even open a case about war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, possibility of an investigation of U.S. troops committing war crimes. The United States sanctioned the lead prosecutor, Fadi Bensouda, and then went ahead and sanctioned her family and said they can't come to Disneyland and so on. That level of basic vindictive cruelty. Well, I suppose the Chinese just turned around and said, Mike Pompeo, you're not welcome in Beijing. You can't come to Shanghai. You won't be on the boards of American companies that are dying to do business in China and so on. Very interesting development. Never seen anything like it.
Right. Actually, Vijay, also important to note that they waited till the government went down because, again, it's an example of sobriety. That they could have done this before, but I think they were trying to send a signal that they don't want to. They're very clear on certain things as well. So it's an interesting look into Chinese policy as well.
And I think political scientists will write MA papers on this theme of the new sanctions world we are living in. I think it's quite amusing. Well, you've been watching Give the People What They Want with Prashant and Zoe from People's Dispatch, and myself, Vijay, from Globetrotter. We come to you every week on Friday. We're live on Facebook. We're on YouTube. We're also a podcast available on all the usual platforms. We'd really like to hear from you. We want you to tell us, we want you to affirm that this is in fact the best global news program on the internet. We only want praise, please, unless your criticism is constructive. Here we are every Friday for you, giving you what you want. That's why our show is called Give the People What They Want. See you next week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.